Hey everyone, this is Mary Frances Porter, and today I am going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the Academy and what it's like and giving you a little tour of what you can expect if you join us. So my goals for today are first to relieve you of your obligation to prove anything and talk to you about the ImpactStory strategy and how it helps with this. I'm going to walk you through how the Academy sessions are structured and show you some of the tools and resources that I provide. As many of you know, I've been working with small and medium-sized nonprofits and their funders for more than the last 20 years. And in that work that I've done with them, I've noticed several challenges, all surrounding the pressure that a lot of nonprofits feel to prove their impact. And I want you to take just a minute and I want you just to think about when the last time was that you needed to prove your impact. I've got a couple of examples here, like maybe a grant that you're applying for or having to go in front of city council. But it really could also just be a donor that calls. It could be a board member or your board chair that wants to have a conversation before the meeting. It could be a news source that calls to ask whether or not you're available to give them a comment on something important that's been happening. And in this pressure and talking to people about where they're feeling the most challenges, I've noticed 5 areas where people are having challenges. The first challenge that a lot of nonprofits feel is the pressure to do program evaluation. And I think this goes back to about the year 2000. A couple of important things happened back in the year 2000. The first was the internet was becoming widely available. And so it was easy to have information out there that people could access. And the second thing that happened was that a lot of the last 20 and 40 years of long-term research was starting to become published. And so you had places like the What Works Clearinghouse that started to be able to create libraries online of programs and practices that had research evidence to show that they worked. Shortly after that, when Obama was elected, he focused on policies that were based on scientific evidence. And I'm all for both these things, but what it did is I think it put a lot of words like this into our lexicon. Words like sample size and long-term impact and statistically significant. And I want you guys just to think for a moment if you've been asked for a comparison group or whether or not your sample was statistically significant or your findings were statistically significant. And very often I notice that nonprofits are being asked to talk about their long-term outcomes. Well, how do you know people take what you have given them and make long-term change in their lives? But really what I've realized over the last several years is that these are all words of scientists. These are words that talk about what is done when researchers are looking to demonstrate impact for programs, or researchers are looking to demonstrate anything really. More recently, I started to look online to see if I could find some people who were not talking about research and what needed to be done. And I found that the Gates Foundation in 2010 published their policy on actionable measurement. Now, the Gates Foundation, they fund both research. So when nonprofits want to partner with a scientist to test scalability or to take an innovative program and test to see whether it works, but they also fund nonprofits just to do their regular work. They call all of this actionable measurement, meaning that they want to have data that actually helps people know what to do. But for the nonprofits that are not engaged in science, they talk about being able just to look at how people are doing and what kind of data is most important to the nonprofit itself. Then a few years later, the Gates Foundation joined a whole bunch of other really large foundations like Kellogg and Ford and stuff. And they created the Listen for Good initiative. And the Listen for Good initiative really focuses on collecting client feedback as a tool for equity and program improvement. And so these two things together help pull the idea of impact measurement out of the scientific world where it's evidence-based practices and having to prove something, and really starting to look at data that helps nonprofits make decisions. So what this led me to do was to start thinking about how program evaluation really isn't the job of nonprofits. I think about nonprofits as being a lot like your general practitioner. So if you are sick, you go to your general practitioner and they diagnose you and they think about what would be most effective based on their knowledge of the science, and then they give that to you. And when you leave with your antibiotics, they aren't also sending home somebody who was also sick but didn't get antibiotics. And they're not looking to see whether or not you get well in the very long term. But what they do is they invite you back to make sure that you're getting better. And in this way, nonprofits are kind of similar. You guys are diagnosing a problem that's in the community. You're bringing people in who have that difficulty. You're giving them something that has some basis in science for you to believe that it works. And then you find out whether or not they've gotten that. But you don't have that obligation to do the long-term science. The second challenge that I noticed nonprofits having, in addition to this program evaluation, but connected to it, is having to do fancy data analysis. In 2018, the Stanford Social Innovation Review did a survey with a whole bunch of social sector leaders. And not only did they find that between 44 and 50% of social sectors were actually getting feedback and prioritizing getting feedback from clients, the vast majority of them said that they didn't collect client feedback because it was too complicated and resource intensive. And this really hit me because it's something that I've noticed too. But I really believe that tracking your impact really shouldn't be harder than tracking your budget. I think what's really tricky about it is that when you're talking about donors or you're talking about your budget, there are already ready-made databases that you can use to help you track those things. And that's because those things have a typical shape. They all have the same form, the same kinds of information that's important to track. But an impact measurement, it kind of has to be tailored to each organization. But once you know what you need to track, it should be very simple and straightforward and streamlined for your organization. And so one of the things I'd like you guys to think about is whether or not this data tracking does feel too complicated and expensive. Is that something that's been getting in your way? The third challenge that I've noticed is actually using that data. So providing that you've been able to gather it and analyze it, how do you use it? And One Cause did a survey at the end of last year, and they found that about 8% of nonprofits didn't have any data, and about 18% had all the data and all the resources they needed. But that great big middle piece, that 72% of nonprofits had at least some data, but didn't really know how to make it actionable. Now, One Cause is a consultant in fundraising, and so they also had this graph here, which shows that the smaller the organization is, the more difficulty it has meeting their fundraising expectations. And I don't think it would be too much of a leap to say at least one problem that those smaller nonprofits faced was with being able to gather and use their data. Here in Charlottesville, this year, our Center for Nonprofit Excellence surveyed 242 nonprofits around our state, and they found that 80% of the nonprofits they found felt that there was an urgent need to be able to collect impact. They also found about 13% also felt it was a strength, and 7% felt it was not urgent. Now, those numbers are relatively similar to the One Cause numbers, and so that starts to make me feel like maybe there's some validity to these numbers, feeling that maybe about 75 to 80% of nonprofits are really struggling here. What then our Center for Nonprofit Excellence did is they said, we really need to be focusing then the nonprofits and the funders on actionable impact for continuous learning and growth, which is very much what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation when we're talking about the Gates Foundation and their actionable impact and the Listen for Good initiative when you're collecting feedback from clients. Okay. So those are the pieces about program evaluation and data, but let's think about how you structure your story. The fourth challenge that I've noticed is that a lot of nonprofits really struggle with the frameworks for storytelling that are out there. Logic models are tried and true. They're perfectly fine. In fact, lots and lots of people use them very successfully. They were developed in the 1950s out of behavioral science, and somewhere in the mid-80s, the United Way published the first book that I've known about on how to use logic models for grant applications. Today, the Kellogg Foundation has the Logic Model Development Guide, and that's the gold standard. But what's interesting about the logic models, and some of the reasons that I think that they're clunky, is that they really focus on inputs, which are the resources that you're asking the funder for. So it's really funder focused. And the funder wants to know how you're going to use those inputs in order to create outcomes that are going to change people's lives. But the language is kind of clunky. It's not connected to the mission. And when you see logic models, they're often really big and lanky and difficult to navigate. With theories of change, this is another incredibly valuable tool that has been used a lot. There's a whole website on the Center for Theory of Change. And what theory of change does is it talks about why what you do is expected to have an impact. And so it actually starts at the end and says, we want to make this big change in the community, and it works backwards. What is it that you need to be able to do in order to make that change? And what's difficult about this, aside from the fact that there isn't like a standardized format or anything that helps guide you in how to do this, but it's also, again, disconnected from your mission, and more importantly, disconnected from your data. And so think for yourselves for a moment about whether or not theory of change and logic models have been tricky to make use of. Even if you're using them, I imagine that the language or how to integrate them into your day-to-day programming has been a little difficult. Tied to this is not owning your own story. So what I've noticed is that a lot of nonprofits that I work with, they're being asked for data from all sorts of funders all over the place. And so whenever they have to demonstrate their impact or talk to someone, what they're doing is they're going to all the different files that they have and pulling out data and sticking it together into something pretty, which I call the shell art version of storytelling. And it's not that it's ineffective, and it's not that it's not pretty, but it doesn't actually represent a story that you own. It doesn't start with the story that you want to tell, which would empower you to be able then to go to the funders and say, here are the stories and the data that I have. Does this match your priorities? I've been working with nonprofits for a very long time doing this, and many of them have talked about how much clearer and how much more straightforward and easy it is to do their work using these strategies. So let's think about this for a minute. Does this resonate? Is this what feels hard? There's these 5 things: having to be a scientist, tracking outcomes feels consuming and complicated, not being sure how to use your data, having frameworks that don't necessarily speak to you, and having to tell someone else's version of your story. I started to wonder pretty early in my work with nonprofits whether there was a simple, straightforward, and affordably sustainable way of capturing impact, so that it wasn't complicated, it wasn't full program evaluation like the science, and that it was something that nonprofits could afford to do and do long term. And so I created the ImpactStory Strategy. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take you through those sections of the strategy, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how the Academy helps you get all the resources you need to implement it. So here's the strategy. It's 3 steps. The first step is being clear about your strategy by mapping it out and knowing exactly what's in it. The second piece is being confident, being able to gather all the pieces of your story so that you can tell it. And then the third piece is being convincing, being able to use your data and the narratives you get from your clients to tell powerful stories. All right. This first section focuses on the challenges of having to use others' framework and not owning your own story. And so we're going to start here with a solid framework. Unlike the logic models and the theories of change, which speak to evaluators and funders, I wanted to start thinking about what kind of model could actually speak to nonprofits. And for-profit organizations and nonprofit organizations are still both corporations. It's just that in Not-for-profit organizations focus on profits, and nonprofit organizations focus on goodness, which is much more difficult to measure than profits. But I wondered if there was some parallel that might help nonprofits using some of the formats that the for-profit world uses. So I started to think about a business plan, and in a business plan, there's some sort of vision or something that you value in the world. And then you do a market analysis to be able to show the venture capitalists why it's important. And once you've established those things, you're going to talk about how you're planning to solve that problem and what investments of theirs that you need and what kinds of return on investment you expect them to be able to get. And so I translated this into sort of nonprofit-y world. And here's the story that I came up with. Let's say that you notice that when your organization started, there's some gap in the community, some problem, some community level need that is an urgent need and that your founders really wanted to eliminate. And when they came up with that, when they noticed that community level need, they also created some vision about what they value and how they wanted the world to be. Then they started to think about, well, what's the piece of the pie? How are we actually going to address this problem? And that becomes the mission of the organization. There are a lot of organizations that focus on a certain problem or a certain vision, but a lot of them do it from slightly different ways, which is different missions. And then different missions have different approaches. So what kinds of solutions they put out there? What kinds of groups of programming do they believe are going to be the most effective to serve their community? Then when you talk about how you're going to do it and what kind of investment you need from your funders, you're really talking about what kinds of programs and activities you're going to be engaged in. And in order to provide those well, what kinds of resources you're going to need from your funders. And so if you have these things in place, then the return on investment for the funder becomes your productivity, which is the breadth and reach of your efforts. And the success and the value of your efforts are shown by the immediate impact on the people that were served. And so this productivity and impact are really the return on investment. So here's the whole story. It reads like a story, it makes a lot of sense, and it's really focused on the mission of an organization, which is to eliminate a community level need. Here's the way I've put it together is what I call a strategic impact map, and this is a picture of it. You can't see it very well here, and that's okay. Mostly what I want you to notice is that each of the sections follows the mission-driven solutions, programs and activities, all the way to immediate impact and the long-term change and community level impact that you're seeking to make. I have a short video of this that you can get through the bit.ly link, and also some templates that you can use at your organization if you want to dig a little bit more into how to create strategic impact maps and how they might be helpful for you. The strategic impact map has really become the cornerstone of the work that I've done. I've done it with lots and lots of organizations, and it's really settled with them, and something that I'm really proud of because I feel like it really creates a better framework and way of telling stories for organizations. So now the second part of being able to map out your strategy is making sure that you have programs that work. And instead of a theory of change, what I did is I created this impact statement, which again is difficult for you to see here, but I'm going to give you some links to things that show you how it works. But what I've done is up there at the top in the dark blue box is I've summarized the local need, that sense of urgency. And then what I do is I look for the citations that I can find online that are not behind paywalls and not academically written that help defend why your programming should work. So sometimes it's a bona fide evidence-based program, and a lot of times it's a series of different kinds of evidence-based and evidence-supported kinds of practices that are available on the internet. A lot of times you have places like HUD or the What Works Clearinghouse or the National Association of such and such, and they often have research already pulled together that help explain what the problem is and how to address it. And then I leave a little space at the bottom just to write any other kind of important information about how services are delivered or what's important to know about the problem. In order to create these actually are, I think, the hardest part of my strategy. And it usually takes me about 5 hours to create one. So it could probably take a couple of days of sporadic work in order to find the research that you need. But I have out in my store a number of pre-made impact statements, and the affordable housing impact statement down there on the bottom right is free. And I encourage you to download it and look at it to get a better idea of what these are. I also have a resource library on my website. And if you go to the tab that says programs at work and you click it, you'll see a whole bunch of different topics. And in many of those topics, I have websites and resources that have evidence-based or evidence-based practices that can support work being done in each of those categories. So in the end, you're going to have a document that on one page is what it is that you're going to do, and on the other side is why it's a good idea and why it's important. And what I also do is I actually cite the different kinds of programming that I have and each of the immediate impacts, long-term impacts, and community level impacts that I'm seeking. So when I'm looking in these articles, I'm just highlighting when I find a practice and when I find an impact, and I'm pulling all that together for my impact map. I have yet to do a strategic impact map with an organization that isn't being ridiculously innovative and not been able to find some level of evidence that supports what it is they're doing. Sometimes it's super, super strong evidence. Sometimes it's kind of moderate evidence, but there's usually people aren't out there trying to work as hard as they work in nonprofits to do things that aren't really achievable, or actually that's not what I meant, that aren't based in some sort of evidence that we don't believe is going to work. I worked with Ready Kids a number of years ago. They have this preschool van. And so it's a van and it's outfitted to be like a mobile preschool. And they go into low-income neighborhoods and they open up the van and they put up a tent and they create like this mobile preschool. And they bring kids and parents in from the neighborhood to learn activities and to do things together and to learn about child development. And they said, we don't have any evidence base for this preschool van. Can you help us? And so we talked about it for a while. They are early childhood experts too. We talked about it for a little while, and we realized that what they were doing was actually getting kids ready for preschool and helping parents understand child development, as opposed to how, in similar way that preschool helps kids get ready for kindergarten. And so we were actually able to do research into the kinds of skills people should have in early childhood. And we were able to find some survey questions and benchmark the different kinds of things that they want to be looking at for the kids that they're serving. Okay, so stop for a minute and just think about what would be different if you had this in your organization today. And let me also stop for a minute and see if anybody has any questions. All right, so now we're going to talk about the challenges that nonprofits feel to do program evaluation and fancy data analysis. And we're going to start with surveys. I want to take a minute and just talk about what surveys are, because it can get mixed up. Surveys ask for opinions or different demographics or experiences. Polls are also surveys, but they're usually just yes, no. I feel really strongly that surveys should not be given pre-post, because when you're asking people about their opinions or their experiences at the pre-point, they don't know what they're not going to know by the post point. So a lot of times people will either over or underestimate the amount they know at the beginning, and then they're answering presumably truthfully at the end, and you might not find much of a difference. So what I recommend is I recommend that people, when they are doing surveys, to only do it at the end and say, based on your experience in this program, how much have you grown in this? Or how much do you agree that you got this? And that way, one, it halves your surveying responsibilities. And two, you're much more likely to get a nice broad range of answers about how much people actually learned from your programming. The only time that you want to use tests is if you're actually measuring the degree of knowledge people have, and these have to be pre-post. So, but you want to think like reading, math, things like that, like really hardcore knowledge things where you can test an amount of knowledge at the beginning, teach some knowledge, and then test whether or not they've actually absorbed it. Needs assessments are actually a little bit like surveys, but needs assessments are really what I think of as diagnostic. Basically, they ask a community or an individual, what do you need? What's going on with you, so that you know what kinds of services and programs you want to put in place. Okay, so what's the value of using surveys? If you use surveys, you're going to know what clients got from working with your organization. So you can ask them, what did you learn from working with us? And they can tell you. And you also can find out how clients feel about getting your services, which is important. And if your surveys are smart, then you've got data that is efficiently collected and folded into program delivery. You have data that gives clients meaningful voice and the ability to help shape the programming in ways that meet their needs and their preferences. It's data that helps you inform programming. If you're not getting the results that you expect, then you can go back and start to figure out what it is that needs to be changed in order to get them. You can actually help assess your staff performance, knowing which staff work with which clients, and be able to get some sense as to whether or not they're all able to provide the same level of service. And you get data that is efficiently collected and used. One thing that I want to mention before we actually go into what the surveys are, and I do a good bit of this in the Academy, and I have a supplemental video on ethics and bias. But when you're creating your surveys, you want to think about the questions that you ask and also the questions that you don't ask, because any question that you ask is clearly and inherently from your value and perspective. So when people create surveys, I suggest that they write down the questions that they want to ask, and then they go and they show them maybe to people in the office, maybe to partners or friends, get a sort of basic sense as to whether or not those questions mean the same things for other people as they do to you. And then before you roll them out to the whole organization, get a subset of your clients, maybe some of your clients that you feel most connected to, that are most invested in your programming, and ask them what they think and whether or not these are the right questions to ask and worded in ways that make sense to them. So what is immediate impact? I argue that immediate impact is really the only thing that nonprofits can measure, because you're not actually there for the long-term impact. The studies and the research that you use that support why your programming is a good idea, that also supports that what they get from programming with you is going to ideally and hopefully lead to long-term change for them. But all you actually have control over is what they get from you while they're getting services. And that boils down to a few things. The first thing it is accomplishments. So these are just things you observe. They're like getting a credential or a driver's license, or building a business plan, or creating a budget for the home, or something like that. They're things that people actually complete while they're in programming and that you can just observe and tick off. However, most of the things that people get from programming is inside them. It's goodness that they absorb that they are hopefully going to take forward into their life. So it boils down to knowledge, skills, and access. So they either learn information, so that's like words in your head, or they learn to do things like lay bricks or do budgets, or they have access, new abilities that reduce barriers and or create opportunities. So this access could be things like reduced mental health. It might be now they have a car or affordable housing or something like that. But it's taking something away or creating something for them that makes it so that they can navigate the world in a more effective way. And you know that the research you should have shows that these immediate impacts lead to some long-term change. But in order to be able to defend that your clients are likely going to do that, you need to know two things. You need to know whether they're confident in being able to take that information and take it into the future. And you want to know whether or not they're motivated to do that. Those are really the most important predictors of whether or not people are going to do work in the future. The last two things that you want to measure have to do with client feedback. And because nonprofit clients often can't vote with their wallet, they can't not buy your services or not use your services. You want to ask them, you want to say, was this programming relevant? Did you feel connected with the program and staff? Did it meet your expectations? Was it something that was relevant to your culture? And were you satisfied with those services? And that is usually asked using a Net Promoter Score, which I talk about in the Academy and what that is. but it basically says, would you refer us to somebody else in the need of the same services? At this bit.ly link, I have created a very short survey that is the essential questions that you would need to ask. So you might not have to ask a knowledge, skills, and access question. Those might be one or two of them. But if the very shortest questionnaire that you can create, very short survey is about 10 questions, and you can get a sample here. Okay. So let's talk just a little bit about data analysis. What do you do with that data once you get it? And a lot of people feel like data analysis feels really unpleasant. And I get it. I mean, I've taken I don't know, 10 years of statistics or something. And I think data analysis feels unpleasant too. But the data analysis I'm going to show you here isn't hard. The first thing that I want you to know is that nonprofits should not and actually cannot do statistics. Statistics are a scientific tool, and they are testing a scientific hypothesis in the context of a scientific design. And nonprofits are doing none of that. They're really doing what scientists call qualitative data analysis. They're finding out what people got, they're observing what people got, and they're using that to show that people have grown over the course of treatment. If you're interested, I have a statistics blog that's linked there that's also on my website that you can read if you want to know a little bit more about why nonprofits can't do statistics. The other thing I want people to remember is that you will make mistakes and you will have to redo your analyses, sometimes many times. This is normal. Don't be distressed when it happens. So there are about 4 Excel formulas and 2 essential graphs that nonprofits need to be able to master. So here are the 2 graphs. This is a line graph for over time and a bar graph for comparing groups. You really don't need more than that. It's nice to be able to do other kinds of graphs, and certainly there are resources out there and in the workbook that I provide about how to do all sorts of other kind of fancy graphs, but the very basic thing you need are these 2 graphs. Okay, so I'm wondering how many of you have more than one person working to understand your data. And I mean, do you have somebody, most organizations have, if they have data, have somebody that's helping to collect it and create the graphs and do the adding and subtracting and averages needed in Excel. But then once you have that data, do you guys have a meeting where a lot of different people can kind of get together and start talking about what the data means? This is what I call an insight and learning team, because this kind of impact measurement isn't about saying whether or not something is good or bad or successful or not bad. It's about learning what's going on and having insights and being able to turn data into understanding and knowledge and action. So before insight team gets together, somebody who's doing the data is going to take all the graphs and put them on a single page or on a series of pages, and they're going to write out what each graph says, literally, like, boys increased more than girls. And the people on your insight team, they're going to mark what's expected, what's surprising, and where they need more information. They're also going to mark what they think is good news and what they think it might be a problem. When you guys get together, you'll go through the graphs and you'll talk about all your questions and insights. And when there's an interesting insight or an interesting question, you're going to start to try to figure out as a group, well, what led to that result? What's happening in our environment or in the organization or with our clients that's making that happen? And you ask yourselves the 3 whys. Why did it happen? Why did that thing happen? And why did that thing happen? And once you've asked 3 whys, a lot of times you get down to the kernel of what it is that actually needs to be changed in order to improve the results. And so then together, you're going to write out what each graph means, and you're at that point automatically going to know what kinds of actions need to be taken to improve results. What's important about a data team is that it happens in the context of a healthy data culture. And this is something that we don't really talk about very much. But a healthy data culture has to be led from the very top. If the board of directors and the executive director are not bought into it, no time and no money are going to be set aside to make it happen. And so if we want to be able to create meetings where we talk about data, and we want to be able to have staff collect data in consistent ways, and we want to be able to have people that have part of their job be to analyze that data, it has to be up there from the very top. You also need training and to help people understand data so that they don't feel overwhelmed and burdened by collecting it. And you can think about things like consumer reviews or Rotten Tomatoes or Common Sense Media. There's all sorts of times that we're using data that's collected out in there in the world to make all sorts of different kinds of decisions. And what you're trying to do at your organization is start to collect data that helps you be able to make those kinds of decisions. The other thing that needs to happen is you need many kinds of knowledge looking at your data. So that data team is going to include people like your executive director, your program director, maybe your marketing director and your development director, ideally a board member, and ideally either someone who's a frontline staff person and or someone who has graduated from services and has the time and the energy, although I do believe they should be paid, to be on your data insight team meeting. And so that creates more equitable and inclusive kinds of solutions. Then when you're in these meetings and in the organization altogether, you need to use the data for good and not evil. So you use it for building people up and knowing what's working and figuring out where your next priority is, as opposed to using it to shame people or to create a culture of like we're failing. So that includes open brainstorming. People need to feel free to say anything that they think might be resulting in those findings or into actions they think might be useful. You need to have an open, curious, and strength-based organization. You need to believe that growth is not only good, but helpful. And you need to seek to understand rather than judge or evaluate. Okay. So if you have these kinds of surveys and you're doing this kind of analysis, all of this data is now aligned and structured and valid and a lot more streamlined and straightforward what it is that you're trying to collect. So now the last challenge is really in using the data, which a lot of people feel really concerned about, as that research shows, but actually you do already know how to do this. So I just want to remind you that how we got here, right? So we've got strong frameworks and programming that works. That identifies the community level need, the long-term change that we expect to happen based on our programming, and also the immediate impact that we expect to happen. And then we use the smart surveys and data analysis to collect and analyze that data. Powerful data visualization, that is making the data that people want to read. And then something called data storytelling is using your visualizations to actually tell a story, to tell people what it is you want them to get from that from that graph. Then you're going to marry your client narratives and your data visualization and the information that you have about your programming working, and you're going to create masterful impact stories that pull people together. And these kinds of stories are ones that actually move people to action because they're really convincing. They really help you see what it is that's happening. All right. So there's 4 essential impact stories, and I give you resources and examples of all of these in the Academy. There's an internal director's report, which is inside facing, and it has all of the information in it from your organization and all of your board dashboards and client narratives and all that kind of thing. You have an annual report, which is typically just good news that you're sending out into the world to help people understand what you're accomplishing. You have one-pagers or graphics that you might be using for social media or press kits or things like that. And of course, you have the all-important grant narrative. Each of these different stories have different audiences, and knowing those audiences is really important when you think about how to highlight data and stories when you're telling them. That's because they all have different purposes. So there's the internal decision making, and there's the compelling ask, and then there's everything in between. And so they're all going to have different strategies of things that you're going to do to make people want to engage with it and to help drive that change in action. I've talked about Java before in a few slides before. I've been working with them for over 10 years. And now that they have all these things in place, Ginger and I talk all the time, one of the things that they're able to do is it keeps their philanthropy department all having the same kinds of outputs and outcomes and being able to have language around what it is that they should be tracking. And so it takes out the guesswork. It makes things write themselves a lot more easily. Okay, let's talk for a minute about masterful data viz and what that looks like. I want you to take a second look at this graph. This is from a colleague of mine named Ann K. Emery, who is my very favorite Excel data visualization tutor or teacher. She has an international business and is a great place to go if you need to learn any of these skills. If you look at this donut chart, it's kind of compelling. It looks kind of sleek. But it's a little hard to read, right? The outer ring is the district, the inner ring is the school, and it's showing you how many kids are eligible for free lunch and reduced priced lunch. So I just want you to look at this series of graphs that Anne creates. This is easier to read. This is even easier to read. And this really is data visualization that tells a story. It helps you understand immediately the relationship between what's happening in the district and what's happening in the school. Powerful impact stories. Let's make an example of this. We're going to say you're writing a grant narrative. So in a grant narrative, the first thing you want to do is be clear. Our students are behind in reading. So there's your local data, the sense of urgency. We're using Program X, which has some hyperlinked citations, 16 weeks, and has been shown to improve reading for students in 4th to 8th grade. So the way that we do our programming is that we use Program X to improve reading scores, but we've actually adapted it to work with 9th grade students also, because our 9th grade students really need that. So now you're in an evidence-informed program. And the 3 reading coaches serve 35 kids a year. So here's our story. After 16 weeks, Nina here, who really loved her reading coach, rose to grade level in reading, as did 70% of the students that we worked with. What's important is that we've got 30% of the students that we work with that are not improving. And what we know from looking at our data are these are the kids that need the most intensive coaching because their reading scores are so low. And so what we really need is we need investment so that we can hire a 4th coach that can be working with those students. So now you can see how you get a human story and a data story, and you put them together so that your stories are clear, people want to read them, they build trust, and they're stories that you can actually use. If you go to this link or QR code, I've created a self-assessment that has 3 questions in each of the 6 bits that help you assess whether or not this is something that your organization is really, really good at, or something that maybe you're struggling with a little bit, just to give you an idea of like, well, where are we in this process? And what I want you to think about is, in a year from now, where would you like to be with your impact storytelling? So after you take that assessment, where would you want to be growing? What would your priorities in that be? And this is where we come to the Academy. My goal is to create straightforward and sustainable systems. And so the ImpactStory Academy is based on, helping people create sustainable ways of tracking productivity and impact. I created this hierarchy of nonprofit needs based on the hierarchy of needs that people know all over the place. And I started to think about, like, what are the essential needs? What do organizations need to run? What do they need to be successful, and how do they grow? And productivity and impact really is part of what organizations need to be successful. So the Academy provides nonprofits with all the information and tools and resources and support needed to implement the ImpactStory strategy. Who should attend? Executive directors or development directors, a marketing director, or a program supervisor, or maybe you have a director of community engagement, or if you're really lucky, you have somebody who's in charge of data already. And I have organizations pay the fee, not individuals. So if an organization joins the Academy, any number of people from the organization can attend. But to get the most out of the Academy, you really should have some leadership that's committed to using data to tell stories. So this should be the first step, or maybe augmentation of your path towards being able to use data. You should have someone in place who can be in charge of the data, and they should come to the academy, maybe 2 to 5 hours a week of work. You want to be able to come to class, and there's some homework to do between classes. You don't have to do the homework, but you'll get the most out of it if you do. And that's about 2.5 hours a week. So really, it's the same investment that ideally you would be making long-term in your data. You also want to have some basic Excel skills. I do not teach Excel. And so you want to not be very afraid of numbers, have that basic Excel skills, and you want to come in with some curiosity and idea about growing. What do the classes look like? So there are actually 8 sessions and 2 office hours. I added an introduction and orientation. When I ran the academy last spring, we really needed an extra session to set goals and to get to know each other. So I have 1 hour there, but then the other 7 sessions and office hours are an hour and a half. And I come in 15 minutes early and leave 15 minutes late in case people want to get some one-on-one. We do a welcome. I present some information about a topic. We have an interactive discussion, sometimes some breakout groups. And then we talk about some sort of homework or thing that you might be able to do between classes in order to get the most out of it. And then there's a closing. Here's another version of how the sessions look. This is the session for session 1. We do introductions and we start talking about the strategic impact map. What you walk away with. You walk away with full ownership of your organization story, which I think is really important, plus the freedom to focus only on immediate impact, which should be really relieving. Once you're done, you should be able to speak clearly about not only your immediate impact, but why you feel it should lead to long-term or community level impact. And you should be confident in the data that you're collecting and how to use it and how to create action. Then you'll have the basis for everything you need to start telling convincing impact stories. Through the class, we will create a strategic impact map, should you want to do that. And we have one of the office hours is strategically placed so that you can use that to help create that. And you should have a revised survey, which another one of the office hours is strategically placed to help you do that. You'll also get access to all of the recordings. All of the recordings of all of the sessions are in a Google folder that only people in your class can access. You get the workbook and toolbox. I have about a dozen so far additional video tutorials that are anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes that take you through deeper dives into various kinds of topics. I have a Google listserv that is a free and forever membership to this ImpactStory network that I call it. And this is so that you can ask questions anytime you have a question, and not just get support from your peers, but it's something that I can monitor and answer questions about too. I also, when I find really cool resources, I toss them into the ImpactStory network. You also will leave with common language that you can use across the organization to improve the way in which you do work and the way you talk about your work. So I ran one in the spring, and again, my good friends from Java came, even though I've been working with it for a long time. And Randy Rogers came in. He found that it was very practical and something that he could use as he left every day. And that's really my goal. I want it to be straightforward, useful, and sustainable. Here's a picture of the workbook so far, all the different pages and links. This is the table of contents, which is hyperlinked to the information itself. These are all the different resources that I have in each of the sections of the workbook. So that you can see what it looks like. I have a lot of lists. So here I'm showing some common impacts. So here's some organizations that have impacts that they already measure or already have articulated that you might want to look at, and another list of possible impacts that I've created. You're going to have links. So I have links to community level data. I have links to regional data, and I even have some links to some local data. And lots of tutorials. So whatever it is you don't learn from me, or whatever it is that you need to know, that maybe you don't already know, I have a hard time imagining that wouldn't already be in here. I've got several pages of different kinds of tutorials and tips and tricks to be able to help you get through what you need to do. And lastly, but really important, I have some great makeovers. So a lot of them are from Depict Data Studio because Anna Emery is fabulous, but we are able to look at how something might look before it has the data visualization and the formatting, and then how it looks afterwards. And this is because if you're going to be formatting and doing data visualization yourself, really the best way to think about doing it is by seeing lots of examples. And lastly, I have a appendix that has recommended consultants in it. So people who are in my circle whose work I really know and really value, I have them give me some little samples of a little paragraph about what they do so that you have ready access to them if you need them. And so I am really pleased with the Academy and hope that you would be too. And for organizations that do the Academy, but then maybe need some support in creating a timeline and being able to train their staff, I also offer one-on-one custom impact story where I work with your organization to help put everything in place and then master everything so that it's really integrated into the common knowledge of the organization. And so that is it for the presentation. I encourage you, if you aren't already, to join my listserv, which is that bit.ly link under the lady looking happy. I've also started a conversation at #ImpactStoryCoaching on LinkedIn, where I love to talk about the role of program evaluation in nonprofits and funders. There's a link here for all the offerings that I have if you want to look at a more detailed version. And I really do encourage people just to schedule 30 minutes in my calendar. This is a direct link to my calendar. I'm more than happy to talk with you about what your needs are and how they might be best served, even if it's not by me.